Some stories begin as inspiration and end as a nightmare no one wants to believe. This is one of them, because behind a family that seemed perfect, behind a woman admired by thousands, there was something no one saw, or maybe no one wanted to see. And that is what makes this story so disturbing from the very beginning. Today, you're going to learn a story that blends faith, power, control, and decisions that change the fate of dozens of people. But before we continue, I need to ask you a question. How far can someone go when everything starts to fall apart? Because sometimes the answer is much darker than anyone expects. This is the story of Flordelis and Pastor Anderson do Carmo, a case that shocked Brazil, not just because of what happened, but because of who was involved, and most of all, because of what was discovered afterward. Because the truth was far more complex than it seemed at first. It all starts long before any investigation, long before the headlines, long before any suspicion. It starts in a simple place, a harsh reality, and a story that seemed like one of overcoming, something that at first glance looked like hope. Flordelis was born into a humble environment, in a community in Rio de Janeiro. From a very young age, she faced loss, hardship, and a life full of obstacles. But there was something about her that stood out, a strong presence, an intense faith, and an ability to convince people that everything could change. Over time, she began attending churches, singing, preaching, helping people, and that's when everything started to grow. She began by taking in children. Children no one wanted. Abandoned children, children in extremely vulnerable situations. And that touched people deeply, because from the outside, it looked like something extraordinary. Just imagine a woman with very few resources opening her own home to care for dozens of young people that not only inspired admiration, but also attracted attention. And with attention came help. Donations started coming in. People wanted to contribute, companies began to support, and little by little, that simple story began to expand. But that wasn't all, because at some point along the way, someone entered her life, someone who would change everything. His name was Anderson do Carmo. When they met, he was still very young, around 14 years old. He attended the same community and went to a service where Flordelis was present. And that meeting seemed ordinary, but it wasn't, because from that moment on, he started getting closer. First to the church, then to the work she was doing, then to the family itself, and little by little, he stopped being just another attendee. He became part of that world, part of the structure that was growing around her. Anderson was described as an intelligent young man, dedicated and deeply involved in religion. Over time, he gained space, trust, responsibility, until something changed. Because at some point, the relationship stopped being just familial and became something more, something that would later raise serious questions. Flordelis and Anderson became involved, and here, something already stands out: the age difference, their previous history, the dynamics of that relationship. But at that moment, it didn't seem to matter, because from the outside, what people saw was a story of unity, a connection that appeared strong, stable, and guided by faith. They got married, built a life together, and continued what had already been growing, the family. But not a typical family, a massive family with dozens of children, some formally adopted, others simply taken in. And that number only grew, reaching more than 50 children, a number that by itself already raised questions. Because it seemed almost impossible. How could someone take care of so many people? How would a structure like that even work? The answer, at least on the surface, was simple: faith, organization, and purpose. But was that really all? Because sometimes what appears simple hides something much more complex underneath. As time went on, visibility increased. Flordelis began gaining space in the media, in gospel music, on television, events, interviews. And the image that was built was clear. A strong woman, a mother of many children, an example of overcoming. Someone who had transformed pain into purpose. And by her side, Anderson was always there, supporting, organizing, managing, because according to reports, he wasn't just a husband, he was the one responsible for structuring everything. Finances, decisions, direction, and that also began to draw attention. Because control, when concentrated, rarely goes unnoticed for long. Because inside the house, things weren't as simple as they seemed. Some reports speak of strict rules, control, differences among the children, and even internal conflicts, but none of that appeared to the public. To those looking from the outside, it was a perfect family, united, blessed, an example of faith and purpose. And maybe that was the biggest mistake, because the more perfect a story seems, the harder it is to notice when something starts going wrong. And little by little, small signs began to appear. Nothing too obvious, nothing that immediately stood out, but enough for those inside to feel that something wasn't right. Conflicts, arguments, tension, and most importantly, a shift in the household dynamic, because where there is power, there is dispute, and where there is control, there is resistance. And that combination rarely ends well, especially in an environment already under pressure. Now imagine this situation, a house with dozens of people, complex relationships, different interests, and a structure where a single figure controls everything: money, decisions, authority. What could go wrong? Maybe everything, because systems like that should depend on balance. And once that balance breaks, everything starts to collapse. And that's exactly what started happening, because while the public image remained flawless, behind the scenes, the story was already taking a completely different turn, a silent path, but a dangerous one, and one that, in a short time, would become impossible to hide. But this is just the beginning, because what comes next is not just about a crime. It's about everything that led up to it, and most importantly, about how no one saw it coming or chose not to see, because sometimes the warning signs are there. They just don't seem important until it's too late. Now let me take you a little deeper into this story, because up to this point, everything still seems, in a way, explainable. A large family, a charismatic leader, an organizing husband, and a structure that, although unusual, appeared to work, at least on the outside. But inside, things were starting to reveal a different reality. Inside the house, there was a division, and it wasn't a small one. It directly affected everyone's daily life. Some children had more privileges, more access, more closeness, while others had much less. Less attention, less comfort, less voice. And over time, that started to create something inevitable: tension. Because no matter the size of the family, when there is inequality within it, there is always a price to pay. And that price begins to show in behavior. Reports indicate there were strict rules, well-defined routines, specific roles for each person. Some took care of the younger children, others helped around the house. Others participated in church activities, and everything revolved around a single structure that controlled every aspect of daily life. The family wasn't just a family, it was almost like an organization, where each person had a role, and where stepping out of line was not a simple option. Because in structures like that, obedience is expected, and questioning is rarely welcomed. And that, over time, creates pressure. And at the center of all this was Anderson. He was seen as extremely controlling. He decided who could do what, who could go out, who could work, and even how money would be used. And that level of control began to affect everyone around him. According to reports, all the money that came into the house went through him, including the money earned by the children who worked. They didn't have full control over what they earned. Everything was centralized. Everything was decided. And that started to generate discomfort. Now think about it. You live in a house with dozens of people. You work, you earn your own money, but you can't decide what to do with it. You have to hand it over and wait for someone else to tell you how much you can use. That, over time, wears you down. And that wasn't all. Some children began to feel suffocated, others angry, others simply exhausted. Because living in an environment like that requires much more than obedience. It requires silence, and not everyone can stay silent forever. Meanwhile, outside, the image remained intact. Shows, events, interviews, recognition. Flordelis kept growing in music, in media, in politics. Yes, politics, because at a certain point, she decides to enter public life. And she succeeds. She becomes a federal congresswoman, and that changes everything inside that house. Now, she wasn't just a religious leader. She wasn't just a singer. She was a public figure with reach, with influence, with power. And that naturally increased the pressure inside the family even more. Because when someone rises like that, expectations grow. And so do tensions. Because when power expands, so do conflicts. Some reports indicate that the relationship between Flordelis and Anderson began to change. More arguments, more disagreements, a growing tension that was no longer easy to hide. And when two people in control begin to clash, the impact spreads to everyone around them. The house, already full, became even heavier. The atmosphere changed, people noticed, even if no one spoke openly. Everyone felt it, and little by little, the conflict stopped being silent. They started showing up in daily life, in behavior, in reactions, in distance. Some children began to distance themselves. Others confronted. Others took sides. And that creates something extremely dangerous: division. Because once a family turns into groups, with different interests and perspectives, the structure begins to weaken from within. Now it's no longer a united family. It's groups with different opinions, different emotions, different interests. And in this kind of environment, something begins to change. Decisions stop being collective. Trust starts to break. And when that happens, the risk grows. Because in environments marked by tension and division, small conflicts can quickly escalate. What was once manageable becomes unstable. And when instability takes over, people begin to act differently, more impulsively, more emotionally, sometimes without thinking about the consequences. And it's exactly in this kind of environment that serious decisions begin to emerge, not all at once, but gradually, like small cracks that keep expanding until the structure can no longer hold itself together. And when that happens, everything collapses. And there's one more detail, something that was only discovered later, something that completely changes how we see this story. Before everything happened, Anderson had already been getting sick, multiple times, with strange symptoms that no one could fully explain at the time. Trips to the hospital, recurring issues, diagnoses that didn't seem to match what was happening. At first, it seemed like something common: health problems, stress, anxiety. But later, those episodes began to be seen in a completely different way. Because during the investigation, the possibility was raised that those situations were not natural. And when you combine that with an environment full of conflict, internal disputes, and strained relationships, the story starts to carry a completely different weight. It stops being just about tension and starts pointing to something much more serious. Now, it's no longer just about a complicated family dynamic. It's about something that maybe had already been developing long before the crime itself. And that is what changes everything, because it suggests that what happened later may not have been sudden. And this is where everything starts to get truly serious, because from this point on, we're no longer talking about disagreements or emotional conflicts. We're talking about something much bigger, something that, when it finally happens, shocks the entire country. One early morning, a sequence of events and a version that, from the very beginning, didn't seem to make sense, because sometimes the first explanation given is not the real one. And that was exactly what happened here. Now pay close attention, because everything we've seen so far leads exactly to this moment, an early morning, silent, like so many others, but one that would change everything. It was June 16th, 2019. Around 4 in the morning. The house was full, as always, but most people were asleep. It was just another ordinary night, or at least it seemed that way, because sometimes the most critical moments begin in silence, without warning, without signs that anything is about to change. That night, Flordelis and Anderson had gone out together. According to her account, they went to the beach, walked, talked, had a moment as a couple, something simple, something that, on the surface, didn't suggest any conflict, just routine. Just another night. After that, they returned home, and up to that point, nothing seemed unusual. But from the moment they arrived, the story begins to raise questions, because small details start to matter. And in cases like this, details are everything. According to what was said, Anderson drove into the garage. Flordelis got out, entered the house, went upstairs, put her things away, followed her routine. Meanwhile, Anderson stayed outside, still in the garage, on his phone, alone. And it was in that moment that everything changed. A few minutes later, several gunshots were heard. A rapid sequence, loud, sudden, but strangely, not everyone reacted immediately. And that detail would later become important, because the house was near a community, and according to reports, sounds like that weren't uncommon. So for a few seconds, no one reacted, until someone called out. Someone realized that something was wrong, that those sounds were not just background noise. Anderson had been shot. Still in the garage, the house fell into chaos. Screams, movement, confusion, people running, trying to understand what had happened. Someone tries to help, another calls for assistance, and in the middle of it all, the realization spreads. He was taken to the hospital, but he didn't survive, and this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because even before any investigation began, there was already a version, an explanation for what had happened. Flordelis claimed it had been a robbery, a homicide during a robbery. According to her, they were being followed, and when they arrived home, the criminals acted. It seemed like a possible explanation, something that could happen. But there was a problem, or rather, several problems, because when the police began to investigate, some things just didn't add up. And that's when the case started to change direction completely. First, the security cameras. The couple's route was analyzed, and there were no signs of being followed, no motorcycle, no suspicious car, no unusual movement. Everything seemed normal, and that already contradicted the initial version presented, because if there was no one following them, how could it have been a robbery? Second, the street cameras. Once again, nothing. No strangers approaching the house, no forced entry, no suspicious presence. The environment remained unchanged, and that created an even bigger inconsistency, because the absence of evidence, in this case, was evidence itself. Third, a detail that may seem small, but changes everything. The dogs. According to witnesses, the dogs didn't react. They didn't bark. They didn't show any agitation, and that raises a very simple question. If it were an intruder, why didn't the dogs react? The answer is disturbing. Maybe because it wasn't a stranger, and at that moment, the investigation changes direction completely. Now the main hypothesis is no longer a crime from outside, but from within. And when that possibility appears, everything starts being analyzed differently. Relationships, conflicts, tensions, everything comes back to the surface. And then comes the first major twist. Just a few hours after the incident, one of the sons is arrested, Lucas. And from that point on, the case begins to take on a completely different dimension. Lucas already had previous issues with the law, and at that moment, he becomes one of the first suspects. Soon after, another name appears, Flavio, biological son. And from that point on, what seemed like an isolated case begins to turn into something much bigger, because now more than one person is involved. Because it wasn't just one individual, it wasn't just an impulsive act. With each new piece of information, it became clearer that this may have been planned. And the more the police investigated, the more details began to emerge, details that didn't match a spontaneous situation. A weapon found, contradictory testimonies, stories that didn't align, and most importantly, a growing sense that the truth was still far from coming out. Because every answer brought new questions, and every new question made the case even more complex. But the most impactful moment comes when one of those involved decides to talk. And when that happens, the story changes completely. Because what begins to emerge is not just an explanation of a crime, but something much deeper, a plot, with multiple people involved, with different roles, different motivations, and with a level of organization that no one had imagined. And from that point on, there is no turning back, because everything that was hidden starts to come out. And what seemed impossible starts to make sense. But at the same time, it raises a new question. If all of this was happening, how did no one notice before? Because when something this complex unfolds, it's hard to believe there were no signs, and yet they either went unnoticed or were ignored. In the next stage of the investigation, everything begins to connect. Each piece starts to fit into place. Testimonies are compared, timelines are built, and patterns begin to emerge. Because when different versions align, they begin to reveal a structure. Now the story reaches another level, because up to this point, there was still doubt, but from here on, answers begin to appear, and some of them are impossible to ignore, because they change not only what happened, but how it happened. After the first arrests, the police start putting the puzzle together and quickly realize one thing: this wasn't improvised. There was planning, and it wasn't recent. The idea had been forming for some time. During the investigation, messages begin to be analyzed. Old conversations, internet searches, exchanges between family members. And what appears completely changes the direction of the case, because it suggests something much more serious. Because, according to investigators, there were indications that Anderson had already been a target before, long before that early morning. Reports indicate he got sick multiple times, went to the hospital, had strange episodes, recurring symptoms, and at the time, none of it seemed fully explained. But later, those episodes gained a completely different meaning. The suspicion, previous attempts, and when that possibility enters the investigation, everything takes on a much heavier weight, because now it's no longer about a single act. It becomes about something that may have been developing over time, a process, a build-up, something that didn't happen suddenly, but gradually. And that changes how the entire case is understood, because it suggests intent. And then another important element appears, a letter, allegedly written by one of the sons. In it, there was a confession, details about what had happened, and most importantly, an indication that it wasn't an individual decision. But shortly after, that version begins to be questioned. The author of the letter himself claims he didn't write it willingly, that he only copied it, and that raises a new possibility: manipulation. And if that were true, it means control over the story continued even after the crime. Now think about it. If someone tries to direct a confession, what else would they be capable of? And that is exactly the question that begins to guide the investigation from that point forward. Investigators dig deeper. They cross-reference information, review testimonies, rebuild timelines, and something becomes increasingly clear. There wasn't just one person responsible, it was a network with different levels of involvement. Some directly involved, others assisting, others aware and choosing not to stop it. And within this structure, one name begins to appear more frequently: Flordelis. Not just as someone close, but as someone who possibly knew more than she was saying. And here comes a delicate point, because at that time, she still held public office, and that brought protection. She couldn't be arrested immediately, which meant the investigation had to move forward with even more caution, more precision, more evidence. Analyzed messages indicated conversations about resolving the situation, about putting an end to it, about not being able to take it anymore. And all of this before what happened. Now the question is no longer just what happened, it becomes why. And the answer is not simple, because it involves something that appears frequently in stories like this: power, control, and wear and tear. According to the investigation, there were internal conflicts, disputes, dissatisfaction, and most importantly, a relationship under pressure. Some reports indicate Anderson was extremely controlling. Others point to conflicts with multiple members of the household. And when that mixes with an already tense environment, the result can become unpredictable, especially when emotions start to override logic. Now imagine that, multiplied by dozens of people, each with their own perspective, their own frustrations, their own limits, and some willing to go further, much further than others would ever consider. And that is where everything begins to shift. The investigation keeps advancing. More people become involved, more names appear, and the case starts gaining even greater scale. Because it wasn't just a small group, it was a structure, a system of relationships under analysis. And that completely changes public perception. Now it's no longer just a tragedy, it's a complex case with multiple layers, and the more is uncovered, the harder it becomes to understand how far it could go, because each new detail adds weight and removes any sense of simplicity. But one piece was still missing, a fundamental piece: the definition of who actually made the final decision, who gave the order. Because in cases like this, there is always someone who initiates everything, and finding that person becomes essential. Because carrying out an act is one thing, but planning it is another. And when that distinction becomes clear, the entire case changes, the responsibility shifts, and the investigation moves in a new direction. And that is exactly what begins to happen. The focus is no longer just on those who acted, but on those who may have planned everything, those who influenced, those who directed. And that brings the case to a much higher level. Because now, it's no longer about a single action, it's about intention, about decisions made before everything happened. And that is what defines how the case will be judged moving forward. Because once the investigation reaches this point, everything changes. It is no longer about reconstructing what happened, but about proving who was responsible for making it happen. And that requires more than suspicion. It requires evidence, solid connections, and a clear narrative that can withstand scrutiny. As the case progresses, the structure becomes clearer. The police are no longer working with isolated clues. They now have a timeline, a sequence of events, a network of people connected by actions, conversations, and decisions that point in the same direction. And at the center of that structure, one name gains more strength, Flordelis, but proving it is not simple, because being close to something is not the same as being responsible for it, and that distinction becomes crucial in the legal process. Because in court, suspicion is not enough. It must be demonstrated with evidence, with consistency, with logic that connects every part of the story. And that is exactly what the investigation begins to build step by step. Analyze messages, cross-check testimonies, investigated movements. Everything begins to point to something bigger than an isolated act, something that involved planning, coordination, and participation from different individuals. Because, according to investigators, there were conversations indicating intent, planning, and even prior attempts. And that changes everything, because now the focus is no longer just on the execution, but on the origin of the decision. Who conceived it? Who supported it? Who allowed it to happen? And from the moment that possibility officially enters the investigation, the case moves to another level. The accusations begin to take shape, not just against one person, but against multiple individuals connected to the same structure. Children, close associates, members of the household itself. And that shocks people, because it's one thing to imagine conflict, another, completely different, is seeing an entire network involved in something so serious. And when that becomes clear, the country reacts. The image of that family begins to collapse. The admired figure becomes questioned, and everything that once seemed solid starts to fall apart under the weight of the evidence. But there was still an obstacle: immunity. Because she held political office, Flordelis could not be arrested immediately. And that created a unique situation. She was being investigated, but remained free. And that meant the investigation had to move forward with even more caution, more precision, more evidence, because any mistake could compromise the entire case. And in situations like this, every detail matters. Every step needs to be calculated.